Welcome to the Holly Bridges podcast. My name is Holly, and this is part 2 of a 2-part podcast looking at breakthroughs in autism. Tonight we have an exciting panel of experts talking about the amazing changes you can bring about when you move away from the traditional behavioural therapies of autism and you begin to apply the latest thinking in neuroscience and holistic health. Believe it or not, autism affects almost 1 in 70 Americans, and there are similar patterns emerging in developed countries worldwide. Here in Australia, the diagnosis has risen by nearly 80% in the last 30 years, and while the diagnosis has increased, the treatment has largely stayed the same. That is till now. My name is Holly Bridges, and I am the author of Reframe Your Thinking Around Autism, and my guests tonight are Dr. Randy Beck from the Institute of Functional Neuroscience.
Unfortunately, when you actually look at the evidence, a lot of these therapies don't stand up.
Dr. Sanjeev Sharma, holistic psychiatrist.
Those interventions' efficacy will increase several folds when you give that brain a right environment.
Dr. John Lawn, psychiatrist and trauma specialist.
But to see the change in both the child and also the family members, that was very convincing for me.
And Mike House, survival and disability expert.
Part of my observation with people with disabilities generally is that they're often constrained by the perceptions of the people around them.
Thank you for joining us. If you want to know more, you can find great resources on my website. Just Google Holly Bridges. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for future editions. Everyone in this room, in their various ways, really likes playing with the dynamism that is autism as opposed to very limited outcomes-focused therapies. John, can you talk a bit about outcomes that you have in your practice or seen working with people with autism from taking a more vital approach?
Well, I'm not as experienced working with autism as some of the other people around the table, I must admit. But what I have seen, particularly in my work more recently, working alongside Randy at his institute, is some very impressive changes, and particularly talking as well to some of the parents who've seen dramatic changes in their own children. So they're often the best witness to results, if you want to talk about results, because they live with these individuals day to day. So it's a very different kind of perspective. But it's actually one of the things that actually drew me in to becoming more involved with the Institute was realising the impact it was having on some of these children, that this treatment approach was having, but also the impact it was having on the families. So obviously we're all very aware of the very negative impact these kinds of problems can have on families. But to see the change in both, the child and also the family members, the parents and so on, and the siblings, that was very convincing for me. So, and I won't speak a great deal about the actual treatments because Randy's really the expert on those, but I mean they are, as you say, treatments that are not the usual, but they are as evidence-based as probably anything in this field. And they are based in a very sort of rigorous scientific way of looking at things, which is based around this idea of the whole system, as we just talked about. And utilising what you might call a range of interventions, which all have a modification of environment or modification of stimulation approach. So everything from basic exercises through to more sophisticated peripheral stimulation using electricity in a modified sense, nothing too dramatic, but sort of peripheral electrical stimulation and so on. But all guided by both the clinical picture but also tests such as EEG, qualitative EEG, which is a sort of brain mapping approach. And what I love about this is it's personalised to the individual. So, and I think this is where it's quite difficult to evaluate in a sort of randomised control trial because it's such personalised medicine. But that's interesting because personalised medicine is a bit of a buzz term in medicine nowadays. That's where people want to get to. They want to have personalised treatments for everything, so that you're not just having a generic sort of cookie-cutter approach. And I think that this approach that the Institute is using is really starting to make that happen, particularly, not just for autism, there are a range of problems, but for autism in particular. And it's working. Yeah. So I think that's exciting.
I've recently been working with a 29-year-old woman and we've done a sort of a second phase of things. In 6 weeks, she can fully look in the mirror, and she hasn't been able to do that for her whole life. And we very personalised, made up all sorts of things. We've been doing eye dancing to Taylor Swift songs, and there was just a whole lot of stuff so that she can begin to feel and integrate her perception with what's going on with her system till she can regulate it enough. And the last day we got her, we built up with small mirrors and different things and how that would register everywhere. And then the last day she could stand with her back to the full mirror, but still felt completely queasy and awful. So we went back and sort of settled her, as she knows how, very well now. And then she could stand and just look and really appreciate that. And her entire system was calm. And it was a huge thing for her to be able to do. And I imagine that will extrapolate to all sorts of other aspects of her world. I'd really like Mike to come back to you in a minute. But Randy, could you talk a bit about the different types of therapies? I mean, I think there's such a range of things you can do to enhance people's capacity and perception and self-perception, etc., to awaken their system. Is that a term you would use? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the starting point is always going back to very primitive stimulus that you would experience, for instance, in the womb, vibration, sound, and then evolve from there into motion perception. So we do proprioceptive stimulus, moving joints, deep tissue stimulus, deep trigger point therapy in certain areas. As John was mentioning, some electrical stimulation, which is basically TENS and interferential type stimulus, sound therapy, also using cerebellar stimulation and vestibular stimulation, brainstem stimulation. We also use what's called a direct current stimulus, which is a new sort of, it's not new, it's been around for a while, but the application of it is now enhanced because of the technology that we now have. These are the types of treatments that we actually use to alter the environment. Now, I'm going to give you just a couple interesting stories. The first one is a 12-year-old that came in, and this child was, the mother brought him in and said, look, he's been to like 3 different schools now. He's going to get kicked out of this school. We can't have this happen because there's no more schools around and no other school is going to take him. Can you help him? Now, right in the very initial examination, we didn't even need the EEG or anything else. We saw that he had a very low threshold for his ability to move his eyes. So he couldn't read because every time he tried to follow a line, he would experience pain. Now, pain, he didn't understand that it was pain. He would just blink and his eyes would water, and he had dyslexic glasses that he would wear, all, the whole story that these kids usually come in with. About 12 weeks later, now the mother first noticed a change. The mother and father first noticed a change after 3 days. They said this kid actually sat down and built a model car, which he would have never done before. He would never have had the attention because his eyes are starting to, he's not having pain anymore. But 12 weeks later, he comes in and he is so proud. And he has won the Principal's Award. He has won the Sports Award. He won the Math Award. He won, all these awards. And this is a child that was going to get kicked out 12 weeks ago. And what you will notice when the brain starts to change, everything changes. It's not just sort of they come in and they say, well, he needs, he can't talk. We want him to speak. The speech improves, but also the coordination improves, and the ability to relate with other people improves, and the ability to understand, internal feelings, and the whole spectrum of reality and life changes because the brain now starts to change. And interestingly enough, rashes start to go away. The immune system starts to become more regulated. Gut issues start to clear up. Constipation, diarrhea, those types of things start to go away. I'm just going to tell you one more story because I don't want to hog the thing, but this just happened. And we have a family visiting from Hong Kong, and they have a 14-year-old boy who has autism, and he has had incredible changes, stark change. You would not believe the changes in this child in numerous areas. Yesterday, they said, we buy into this whole environmental stimulus thing. We're going to take him skydiving. So they took us skydiving, and it was amazing to see the change in the child when they finally got to the ground. But it was interesting. They said, "Do you want to do this again?" And he said, "No." So he was totally white when he got up. But they were trying to take it to the limit and change this environmental stimulus. I don't know if I'd advise skydiving, but they tried it.
Yeah. Maybe a bit too far, which is a lovely segue to you, because that's what you'd like to do. Perhaps not skydiving, but really bringing people to vastly new experiences to draw them out, inspire them.
It's interesting, Holly, that a lot of the last few passages of conversation, there's been elements of emotion and perception and all of that built in. And I think, one of the very practical kinds of elements that I bring to the table is, I look at us human beings as a mechanism of survival, and when you look at us in that kind of state, if we're under deep duress, then our emotional state makes a big difference. Many of the people that die in the outback die because they're under pressure, and coronial reports will say things like their actions didn't make sense, they were nonsensical. And it's because they're not acting rationally. And it's curious that we expect people, both professional people, practitioners, support people, etc., around somebody to respond to pressure in a very rational way. But one of the things that we know is that when we get pressured, when we get emotional, particularly when we're pushed into that sort of fight, flight or freeze kind of state, we actually get more stupid. Frontal cortex shuts down, we're less able to access what we can, and a lot of people come into the environment, I think, with a sense that I don't know, and therefore I'm anxious about what I'm doing here as a professional person. So straight away they're on the back foot, and they're trying, ego, defensiveness, all of that sort of stuff comes into play. And then there's this assumption that the person's perception, what Randy was saying about perception, is that for it to be okay, it's got to look the same as my perception. And one of the things that we fundamentally miss is that all of our perceptions are flawed. It doesn't matter where we come from, whether we happen to have a label that somebody's given us on account of a diagnosis or not. All of our perceptions are flawed. We only see a fraction of what's around us. And it's so filtered based on our life experience and all of that. So a big part of the picture for me is building environments where people feel psychologically safe enough to step outside of what's usual for them and to try new things on. Being able to build a sense of, it's okay to have a go, it's safe enough to have a go. And so something like skydiving, that's radical for pretty much any human being. Some of the research around fear with magnetic resonance imaging of brains of people who never skydived before. Their frontal cortex shuts down for about 5 seconds. It's like they've had a lobotomy. So we're putting people into really interesting places, and the only way that you can do that is to build enough of a sense of trust in the people around them and what's happening. I think if you try to take people into extremely different environments without doing that, it's just irresponsible. And I would say that's irresponsible for any human being, regardless of what label they happen to carry. But if you can do it in a way where activities are sequenced, so people get an opportunity to build competence and experience and comfort with what they're actually doing, if there's opportunities to tap into how is this person communicating, yes or no, so that you can say, well, here's an evolution of that. Do you want to take a bigger step into something even more unknown? And they're able to say yes or no in whatever way they do that, whether that's eye movement, muscle movement, verbally, however they do it, and you can build that kind of picture of trust. Then people will explore their edges. It's one of the things human beings are known for, right? We like to get out and play with what can I achieve, what can I do, how can I make things easier or better or create more with what I've got. And, fundamentally that stuff's hardwired into us from a survival point of view.
Yes. And what I love about your work is implicit in it is every single person, whatever aspects of their physical and mental being are not functioning at peak, everybody likes to go past their limits and do more. and will always do much more than anyone, well, a lot of people might perceive. I just think it's just a really interesting part of looking at disability and autism in that sense.
I think what you're saying there about their limits is really important as well, because often the expectations and the limitations that are put on people are either really, really small because of the label that they hold. They go, right, if that person has autism or any other kind of condition, then we perceive that they're only capable of this. Or we go to the opposite extreme and say the only version of legitimate experience is for this person to be able to do things the same as everybody else. So, if we're actually saying, what's your experience? How does the world appear to you? Let's try and understand that and hear about your unique perception. And for me as a professional, part of that process is saying my perception is different to everybody else's on the planet. If we can just bin that idea that we're somehow all homogenous, and that was something that Randy was saying before, then we've got a really rich starting point to go, well, there's diversity all around us. Let's get curious about that rather than trying to put people in boxes and saying it has to look this way for it to be legitimate or okay or rational or logical, and then explore where we can go from that.
Yes, and then it gets thrilling, and then you get results, and you get very different results. It's why I'm much more in favour of that kind of approach than a behavioural outcomes kind of approach, because if you know where you're going, you can't go anywhere half as interesting as if you start exploring. You're just ending up somewhere quite different, and it's very client-driven then, which is where the personalised treatment comes in. You just don't know, like all of us here in a sense. You just have to listen to each person and see where they need to go next and the next step. Sanjeev, you've been listening to all of this. Have you got anything to add?
I think I totally agree, because what happens is that, like, majority of the time, until unless people are not in the window of tolerance, like there's sensorimotor psychotherapy, there's an approach where it is told that either person can be in a flight mode or a freeze mode. And the reality is that if our ventral vagus is regulated, then we are going to be in a window of tolerance. Now, what we are really talking about is that trying to regulate that branch of vagus nerve, which is going to help us to regulate our emotions, our connections and everything, and we don't panic or become anxious. Now, but certain times what happens is that, like, majority of any psychotherapy approaches, there's no problems with any of them. But when we are not putting that into a perspective of that particular individual and don't work, there's a very likely chance that there's a failure. I can give you an example of a person who has got a schizophrenia now, and he's been managed by a public mental health system, and he had a history of substance use disorder which resulted in a psychotic episode resulting in a schizophrenia. This is a pattern which Sean would agree that this is not an uncommon which we see all the time. He eventually ended up on clozapine, which is one of the most potent antipsychotic, and is well aware that although this is a very good medication, but it comes with a lot of side effects. Now, this person had an issue around anxiety or a social anxiety, particularly when he was going out in the dark, and secondly, if he has to face some group of people whom he was not comfortable with. Now, when we started working together, he came to know about my kind of approach and then said, like, okay, I'm not going to stop your medications because this is not something, it's not like either all. It is something which we are going to combine. One of his wish was that he wanted to watch a match in Boxing Day in Melbourne. And ever since we started working on his biochemistry, where we make some changes in his diet, and also we went for his stool examination and prescribed some changes, some specific probiotics and gut lining agent. So in reality, what I've done is that he had a wish, he wanted to do something or accomplish something. So he was willing to try, but he could not succeed, because what happens is, the moment he was put up in an overwhelming anxious situation, his psychotic symptoms would flare up. Not to a point that he would require an admission, but he would just decompensate and just retract back, and this was a pattern which was going on. Now, this man on Boxing Day successfully went to Melbourne and watched the match for the whole day. And he not only sat down in few group of people, he sat down in among 50, 60,000 who were there. And it was such an excitement on his face when he came back, and so much rewarding. Like it is, and that kind of approach could have never been achieved if you would have done a traditional way. So that's what we are talking about, that all modalities which are going to be what we call as complementary, if they are combined together, I have no reasons to say that the efficacy of these all complementary approach will be several folds than our standard intervention.
The common thing that like Mike was saying about when you expand someone's environmental adventures, they invariably are proud.
Yes.
And, like you were talking about this guy he did what he wanted to do and he was proud. The child that, didn't get thrown out of school, the pride on his face. The person who cooked the breakfast, obviously, I would assume, was proud.
Absolutely.
Of what they did. So you cannot take the environmental stimulus and separate it from the emotional result that happens. So if you don't understand your environment and it's not being processed properly, you have an emotional expression problem or perception problem also.
Yes, and a huge esteem problem, self-esteem, which you start building all the other capacities up. The self-esteem just rises astronomically, doesn't it? And you can have multiple, as we're saying, approaches to that, but at the end of the day, the person becomes full.
So, just following on from what Randy was saying, that a big part of the picture is about how people with disabilities, whatever particular label they carry, they tend to be cotton-wooled. So people are very averse to exposing them to any sort of risk. And, when I say risk, I'm not sort of saying go out and do dangerous or silly things by any means. But, the average person gets to decide what their appetite for risk is, whether they want to dive off cliffs with wingsuits or whether a risk for them is actually just leaving their house or trying a new meal on the menu. And I think that's a really important part of the picture, is that we give people the opportunity to test things out that are new for them. Randy was talking about pride and that sense of achievement, and risk is a big part of where we get that. We learn where our personal boundaries are, we learn what stretches us, we learn where we're comfortable and where we're not, and we get to push those edges when we get to take risks. And a lot of people just get denied that because it's seen as too scary, too risky. Things like duty of care get bandied around a whole lot as the reason why not. And again, I think, the way to explore that in a way that is useful and relevant for people and also keeps them safe, it comes back to that communication that we were talking about as being very central before. If people explore ways to communicate with people, even if they're in a linguistic minority of one, then they get to choose and to say this is working for me or not in whatever way suits them, and to explore their boundaries and constantly push them back. And from there, they develop more and more and more of themselves. They get to see themselves at play and at work and in situations that they didn't anticipate, dealing with those dynamic environments, however big or small they are. And from that comes all of that self-confidence and pride and emotion that goes with it, which gives you the opportunity then to step out even further.
And keep growing. The idea of risk also was popping into my head while you were talking in terms of choosing other therapies, because we have a very sort of standard way of looking at autism in particular, and certain therapies are the go-to. It's quite risky for parents to go and try new things. They generally do after they've exhausted all the other options. Can you talk a bit about that, Randy, in terms of the sort of the dominant paradigm for what people generally do with autism, being ABA, behaviour therapy, things like that, and how difficult it is for parents to shift gears and go down the route that you do, or Sanjeev with your stuff as well? People sort of come to you after a while, don't they?
Most of the people who come to see us have been to see at least 6 other clinicians or doctors before they come to see us. And they come to see us basically at the end of their rope, They've tried everything else. Now, that's how it used to be. Now it's slowly changing so that we're now only third in line or something like that. But you are right. There are traditional therapies that have been traditionally given the bona fide approach from whatever powers that be. Unfortunately, when you actually look at the evidence, a lot of these therapies don't stand up, just like any other new therapy coming along probably has just as much evidence as any of these other therapies and may show better results. Now, as Sanjeev was saying, we can always have a combination of things. But I think the two biggest risks are, number one, that you apply a standardized approach to every child or every person, which doesn't work. And we've had these attempts before. I don't know if you remember the DOOR program that was put into all the schools at great expense. And every child received these exercises to do. And the problem with that was that every child didn't need those exercises. In some cases, they were actually wrong. So there's an old saying, if you're paddling your canoe in the wrong direction, going faster doesn't make things better. So the same thing applies to this. You have to make sure that you have the right therapy for your child. How do you do that? The only way is to have individualized testing done, whether it's gut biome testing, genetic testing, EEG analysis, whatever you choose to do, or do them all. But you have to have an individualized approach. If you don't, you're probably wrong more times than you're not.
We'll probably wrap up quite soon, but could we go around? Is there anything anyone would like to add before we finish up?
I think I would agree with Randy, and most of the time now I have started seeing some of patients who are referred by some of my colleagues because they are labeled as treatment resistant, which means that they have been tried on all available pharmaceutical agents, psychotherapy, ECT, and all other treatment modalities. And now what we have is nothing is left. So what else you can do? And then when people are coming with this, they are quite hopeless. And a lot of time they have been lost their jobs and also their... So I can give you a classical example of a patient who came to me about almost 1.5 years back. And this person had a treatment-resistant depression and was on combination of a classical, very strong antidepressants, which are we called as MAO inhibitors. Okay, we don't use them now often because there are a lot of dietary restrictions when we prescribe them along with lithium. This person has a successful family history of suicide, and he was a 25-year-old man. In this person, what my approach was that, okay, you have tried this, it hasn't worked. Now, if you are going to try something different, you have to be a bit patient, because what happens is a lot of times they have already lost their patience by trying different things. And the key to success for any of these complementary modalities are not that they are going to be a quick fix. Okay, it has not come up in one day, it will not go in one day. And I always give them a broad that before you have been suffering from these illnesses from last so many years, please give a decent shot of 8 to 12 months before you say it has worked or not worked for you. This man agreed. We successfully were able to wean off some of his medications. We went for his metabolic screening profile. So I checked for his micronutrient status, his metabolism status, which we call as methylation status. And we never got a chance to check his biome because that time he could not afford it, because that's again a test. Some of these tests are not covered by Medicare, which is a very unfortunate, because a lot of times we can make a big change in the treatment approach if we have these things available. After we gave a trial of weaning off the medication and started these supplements, some of them were nutraceutical agents. Within span of 4 days, this man slept for 8 hours. This man was on Centrelink benefit. He was a liability to the society. Now he has gone back to work. Now he's an asset to the society. Now the way we have been treating disability, that they are a liability to our society. Okay, there is a possibility that there will be some we cannot make them able or make them to join the workforce. But if out of that bunch, if you are able to make some people able to earn a livelihood or at least boost their self-esteem or self-confidence, I think we have done the job. And I can quote this person, and he's willing to speak about him in every forum, because now almost 1 year down the track, he has gone back to workforce and working full time and doesn't require Centrelink anymore.
Very different outcome, and actually not a very long space of time.
Yes.
A year isn't that long. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting as well is just hearing what everyone's saying is this thing about expectations. And I think it cuts in two ways. It's expectations for patients and their families, but it's also expectations amongst us as well, and clinicians and people anyone who's working with people who are struggling with these kinds of issues. And we're talking about lots of different issues, but particularly autism, but we're talking about a range of things. But I think the trouble is is that thing about perception again. We all have our mindsets, and we catch ourselves at times, I think, realising that we've closed down. Our expectations of this person in front of us are immediately starting to close down because we're buying into other models, or we're buying into an approach. And then every now and then we have an example and we think, oh my goodness, I've probably closed down too many people because I haven't seen the potential, because I haven't been prepared to just try that extra. Sometimes it's the person themselves walks away, but I think we as the people who are trying to help and trying to open up new options, we've constantly got to keep that open mind. This person could possibly do well if we can just get the right combination of things and look at it from a different angle and so on. So that's a challenge for us, as well as for patients, clients, consumers and so on, to keep that openness to human potential, because that's one of the things we touched on at the beginning, and it's not to buy into sort of a slightly negative mindset, which I think in professional circles we can do, because we can get a bit jaded at times.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. When you find that spark of the person and you work with them, it starts to flicker and grow and grow and grow, doesn't it? Yeah. Last words?
Love what you said there, John, around just staying open-minded. For me, a big part of the picture is just remaining curious, and we can shed light on our blind spots just by being curious about how other people see the world. And I think one of the gifts of working with people who are different from how we are, whether that's because they wear a label of some kind or they come from a different profession or whatever it happens to be, is that we get an opportunity to be exposed to a different way of seeing the world. And if we're genuinely curious about that, often we have those delightful human moments where we get a spotlight shone onto one of our blind spots and we have a glorious aha moment, and we get to see the world in a whole different way. And part of the work that we potentially do for people is create those kinds of moments or deny those kinds of moments. So staying open-minded is a really big part of it, activating our curiosity, being like kids are, really interrogating stuff and getting into it and trying to understand why and how things work. And for me, one of the benchmarks of that is to just hold the filter of, what will we think of this in 100 years' time? We look back over 100 years when we were putting people with autism on old ship hulks out in Freo Harbour, and we go, that's disgusting, how could we ever do that? And I often wonder, what will it be like in 100 more years when they're looking back on the sorts of things we're trying now and saying, what were they thinking? Hopefully we just keep on evolving and getting better and better, and the only way we can do that is with curiosity.
Curiosity, yes, and we are all the same because everyone's got a nervous system and everyone's got a way of perceiving. So you start playing with people in that way and you're aligning with them. Then you find out what they think, and then they find out what they think too. But you kind of can't miss if you go in from that angle. It's not always that easy with people with autism, and you've got to pick your spaces. But at the end of the day, we are all the same, aren't we? Just, in our own quirky old ways. Thank you all so much for coming. You're brilliant, and I'm very excited to start to explore this issue some more. I think it's really important. I think it's really valuable. I think we are evolving. I think we will look back in 100 years and be glad that about now we started to really turn things around and make a lot of difference, but also really appreciate human differences and who people can be and what they bring to the world. And I think that's starting to become something that's quite lovely. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes part 2 of our 2-part podcast on breakthroughs in autism. My name is Holly Bridges, and you can find more on my website. Just Google Holly Bridges. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for future editions.